Hi, Prof. Janine. Welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to the students at ANU today.
It's a great pleasure, and as someone who spent a lot of my time at the Crawford School at the ANU, I'm very happy to be back, even if virtually, and to have a chance to talk to some of the great students there. So thanks for inviting me.
All right, thanks. I'll jump right in. One of the themes that we're exploring this week is different types of relationships that governments engage in delivering public services. And I wanted to ask you if you reflect on your work, and is there a preference for a specific type of tool or relationship that governments have come to rely on in delivering public services, rather than considering a broader set of relationships such as commissioning or contracting?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things in studying how governments structure these relationships for about 20 years now, it's a very long time to, to look at something like this. Over that time is to see that there's a real preference for very specific types of relationships. And that's the case in many parts of the world, not all parts of the world. And obviously governments change over time. But if I had to say that there was a very strong preference for something, it would be a model of outsourcing. And this is a model really where we see, governments trying to articulate what it is that they want to purchase, going out usually through competitive processes, not always, and selecting another party to deliver something for them. And this has really become, I think, the dominant model in many parts of government for how to get things done, or how to get the business or the government, the work of government done, for lots of reasons, which we can talk about. But there's a full sort of menu of options that we could use with lots of different types of parties, and certainly using lots of different sort of mechanisms to connect to other parties. But certainly over the last 20 years or so, of researching all of these sort of ins and outs of different types of relationships and why you get into them and out of them, and how to structure them, that for me has emerged as sort of the preference for many governments around the world.
Or is that just being part of a dominant orthodoxy?
Yeah, I think there's lots of reasons, and over time those reasons might have sort of changed. But certainly governments across all levels in Australia, and I started doing my own research on government contracting, looking at municipal or local government, and over time started to look at state or subnational and then national government. There's a really strong preference for outsourcing in Australia. At the start of that sort of movement towards outsourcing, we saw a lot of debate about the cost savings that could come from using this particular tool. And I will talk about it as a tool because that's really what it is. And this sense that emerged in an era which many of your students will be familiar with, I'm sure, in your class, which is the new public management. Well, now the old public management, but at the time certainly the new public management, where we started to look at much more tools that were drawing on, I think, ideas from the private sector, but thinking about the nature of relationships very differently. So the idea was that, we could make quite large cost savings if we use the discipline of competition, engaged in market-like processes, and were able to clearly specify what it is that we wanted to purchase, whether we were purchasing pens or we were purchasing welfare services. And of course, all of the people in your class will know that the sort of complexity of those is very different. So procuring for the purchase of stationery might be relatively simple, but procuring for complex mental health services is pretty difficult, actually. But we became obsessed, I think, with this very particular tool in the start because there was a very strong belief that it would deliver large-scale cost savings. And in Australia, there was a very specific number that was attached to that in the sort of advocacy around outsourcing and contracting, which was this idea that if you just did it, then you would save 20%. And it became this mantra, really, that engaging in outsourcing would just, in and of itself, deliver those savings. And so I think we had generations of managers in the public sector, and perhaps more importantly, governments, who believed that the simple act of engaging in these more market-based approaches and setting out tendering processes and encouraging competition would, in and of itself, deliver cost savings. And that was a very, very strong driver for this in the Australian context.
Do you think this tool is fit for purpose to address the challenges that governments face these days?
I'm going to say my answer to everything, which is it all depends. And I hope that every student who comes out of your class will always keep a line like that in their mind. It all depends, but it's important to know what it depends on.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly outsourcing works in some contexts for some tasks. And there's no question that if we're in a situation where we can clearly articulate what it is that we actually want from the other party, where we have got competitive markets with a healthy sort of set of suppliers and providers, then using an outsourcing model can work very well. But we have to be able to articulate what it is that we want. We need to have competition, and we need to be able to monitor and measure performance. And in fact, most of those are extremely difficult in some of the areas of activity that government is engaged in. So I would say, yes, it does work in some contexts for some tasks. And then we've used it in other contexts for tasks where it's totally inappropriate. And what we see is a whole range of dysfunctions and problems that emerge from that. So we can create what some people call perverse incentives for providers and suppliers to work in a way that actually doesn't help us get to the outcome that we want and takes us off in a different path. We get corruption. We can get really terrible outcomes by sort of getting a wrong match between what it is we're trying to achieve and the type of relationship.
Thanks. As you know, many of our students are from Asia Pacific economies, and their governments are the mantra public-private partnerships. Contracting is the mainstream orthodoxy over there. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the type of capabilities that the public managers and their governments would need to manage some of these types of tools.
Yeah, sure. It's a really interesting question, because once we start to think about the range of different types of relationships, and public-private partnerships is a really interesting one, because in a book I wrote some years ago now with a great colleague of mine, John Alford, we talked about sort of substantive public-private partnerships versus rhetorical public-private partnerships. And some of your students will have experience in their own countries. Every country around the world we see this. Partnerships that actually are partnerships, mutually adjusting, collaborative, where you might design together the outcome and how to get there. And other ones which are rhetorical, which are basically just long-term contracting or outsourcing, but you wrap around the language of partnerships. It's not really a partnership at all. And so I think with each of those different models, even if we contrast sort of a substantive partnership with a rhetorical one, we can see very different sets of skills that might be needed. So if you're going to go the mode of a sort of collaboration with other organisations in a PPP, if you want to use that example, then you need to think about I think two sets of questions. One is, or two tasks perhaps is the better way to think about it. There's a task which is how do we decide whether we do it ourselves and who to work with? And we call this in our work the externalization decision. So when do we decide who we're going to work with and whether we'll work with other parties or do it ourselves? So there's a whole set of decisions and capabilities and skills for those who are making that decision. And sometimes that decision is a political one, not one that's made by bureaucrats. And so I might leave that to the side because many of our students that you and I both would teach in programs like this will be more in the second task, which is how do we manage the relationship? So if you think about a much more collaborative partnership-based model, then you have to be able to work together in defining what are the outcomes that we want to reach. So you need to be able to think about sort of longer range outcomes rather than just outputs or processes that you might be interested in. You need to be able to develop really good negotiation skills. And I don't just mean negotiating to get a great deal at the start, but a sort of iterative negotiation over time, particularly for some countries around the world that get into very long PPPs. So I remember a student in my class, actually, when I was at the Crawford School, was telling me of an example in Cambodia with a 99-year PPP, which to me was mind-blowing in many reasons. But if you're going to get into a relationship that's that long, then you've got to be able to negotiate over time, because the conditions that you're in will change. You tend to think a lot about trust in substantive partnerships, and understanding how to, who's accountable for what. And we also looked at sort of issues around diplomacy and how to tolerate diversity of different actors in that environment. If you're thinking about more of a sort of long-term outsourcing model, and a lot of public-private partnerships are more that, and so that's much more like the outsourcing I was talking about before, then instead of thinking often about sort of the long-term outcomes, we tend to think about outputs. So we need people who can have clarity of outputs. What is it that we're trying to actually get out of this relationship? They also need negotiation skills, but probably a different sort. They need to be able to negotiate a great deal, and get all of that locked down into what are usually fairly legalistic styles of contracts. And if you don't get them in at that stage, then it can be very problematic. And they need to be able to structure incentives really well, because what you're trying to do is predict the behaviour of another party once you've locked them into a legalistic style of contract. So you have to be sort of looking into the future. How would they behave if we set up a incentive structure like X versus if we did it by Y? And so we're trying to predict human behaviour almost when we're structuring incentives. And also we need to be able to monitor performance. Now we need to do it in both types of relationships, but we might do it really differently if we're thinking about something as a substantive partnership versus a very separated relationship between what we might call a principal and an agent.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Janine. Those are really helpful and considered responses. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
You're more than welcome, and good luck with the rest of your course.
Thank you so much.